Today, I will be going over players that you should be avoiding in the middle rounds of your fantasy drafts. Let's get to it. First up is Josh Allen. In 2019, he had a great season. He went for 3,089 passing yards and 20 touchdowns, while adding 510 yards on the ground and 9 rushing TDs. At the Fantasy Friend Zone, we love rushing quarterbacks. And yes, Josh Allen is big and physical and he loves to use his legs, but he doesn't do well against good defenses. We saw how much he struggled against the Patriots and the Ravens last season, and he's going to have more of those tough matchups in 2020. Let's look at the schedule. He plays the Pats twice, the Steelers, Broncos, Chargers, and the Niners. He has 5 of these matchups in a row to end the season, and that's not something that you want during a playoff push. If you do want to draft him so that you can use him in the earlier weeks, I guess that's fine, but do you really want to spend that high of a draft price on someone that you're only going to use for half the season? Fantasy Pros gave Josh Allen the second toughest strength of schedule for all of 2020. This is a very clear problem because at the end of last season, we saw his production take a dip when he was facing more stout defensive units. Teams started to figure out how to play him, resulting in him being the QB 26 over the last 4 weeks, averaging just 12.23 fantasy points per game. This year, it's a lot like most of the recent years in terms of quarterbacks. There are so many options. Don't waste a 6th or 7th round pick on Josh Allen when you can get guys like Stafford, Ben, Cam in the 10th round and later. Next up on the list is Hunter Henry. He steps into a new QB situation. So it's either going to be Justin Herbert, terrible, or Tyrod Taylor, a downgrade from Rivers still, and especially for the tight end. This offense, it's going to be worse. They're going to be scoring less touchdowns, and that's what's made Hunter Henry fantasy relevant in the past. Last season, he had 55 receptions and 5 touchdowns on 76 targets. The efficiency and quality of the passes that will be coming Henry's way are going to take a hit as well. He's currently being drafted in the 7th round. Now, this doesn't make any sense because this offense is going to be worse, and we don't even know how much he'll be targeted. Anyways, don't make this pick, especially when you can wait 4 to 5 rounds later for guys like Hurst, Gesicki, Hawkinson, and Fant. I mean, the list goes on. There's just so many better values and even just straight up better players later in the draft. Next up is Raheem Mostert. Kyle Shanahan. He isn't one to exclude players, especially his precious running backs. The 49ers used 4 different running backs last season. Tevin Coleman, Matt Breida, Raheem Mostert, and even Jeff Wilson, who was their temporary goal line back for a short time. So this backfield has 3 RBs returning from last year and McKinnon, who, if he's healthy, Shanahan will undoubtedly use him in the game plan because he was supposed to be the starting running back when Kyle Shanahan first got to San Fran. When it comes to these murky running back by committee situations, it's always best to be taking stabs in later rounds. We know that this is a running back by committee, and we know that Tevin Coleman is the highest paid RB on the team, and we don't know how these touches are going to play out. In 2018, it was better to have Matt Breida, a guy who went late in drafts or wasn't drafted at all. In 2019, it was Mostert, who either went very late or undrafted. Most likely, this backfield, it's just easier to avoid, unless either Coleman or Mostert fall in your fantasy drafts, but at Mostert's current 5th round ADP, going about an RB2, I mean, we're not even sure if he'll be receiving 50% of the workload. Last season, he went for 772 rushing yards and 10 total TDs on a 36.4% snap share. If you're investing in a guy in the first 5 rounds, they should not have this big of a question mark in terms of their volume. This makes him a very risky pick, and the 5th round is just not even close to where he should be going in drafts. Next on the list is Marvin Jones. Imagine you're on a roller coaster with a blindfold on. You don't know when it's going to go up, when it's going to go down, or when you're literally going to do a full loop. This is how Marvin Jones makes me feel. Like I'm blindfolded on a roller coaster because I cannot predict when a big game is going to happen from him. Typically, running backs are more predictable and consistent on a game-to-game basis, and receivers are more volatile from game to game. And this is especially true for Marvin Jones. Last year, he had 62 catches for 779 yards and 9 TDs on 91 targets. And that was with only 8 games with Stafford, so there is an argument to be made that his end-of-season numbers could improve. The point here is that it is just impossible to know when this guy is actually going to produce. He could be against a top defense on any given week and just completely go off. Or he can be against a very subpar defensive unit and put up a goose egg. I have yet to come across any data or research that suggests a trend to better predict his game-to-game fantasy production. Now, I highly recommend going for upside as you get later in drafts, and from an end-of-season perspective, Marvin Jones has that, but I'm not going to participate in this week-to-week guessing game of Marvin Jones fantasy production, and I don't know why you should either. So let's compare him to Will Fuller. Will Fuller, obviously one of the most injury-prone receivers in football, but at least when he steps on the field, you know that 4 out of 5 times he's putting up high-end wide receiver 2 numbers. I would rather have Will Fuller just 6 games and know that in all of those games he's going to put up big numbers instead of playing this trivial game of randomness and regret with Marvin Jones. Don't go on a roller coaster with a blindfold on. Okay, this next one, I know it's going to be a bit controversial of a pick because a lot of people are high on him going into this season, but next on the list is the Rams tight end Tyler Higbee. His first 3 years in the league, he played a fairly minor role in the Rams offense, never hitting the 30 reception or 300 receiving yard mark, and last year, up until week 12, it was basically the same story. He had one game where he had 10 fantasy points, and then from weeks 2 through 12, he never got more than 7 fantasy points in half PPR scoring. But something happened between weeks 12 and 13, because Tyler Higbee was not playing like Tyler Higbee anymore. He was putting up like Gronk numbers, perhaps with less touchdowns, but his yardage totals from weeks 13 to 17 were just insane. The dude was averaging over 100 yards a game during this span. So he was obviously playing out of his mind, which leaves the fantasy world wondering, what can we expect from Tyler Higbee this upcoming season, and are we going to see another Tyler Higbee should be on the waiver wire, just undraftable fantasy production, or are we going to see a continuation to this Tyler Higbee breakout? Heading into last season, Gerald Everett was this late-round sleeper pick and waiver wire flyer at the tight end position. And for the most part, we just saw a lot of inconsistency from Everett, but he was playing and on the field up until week 12. And at that same time, Higbee had his usual low fantasy output. Following this week 12 injury, Gerald Everett missed 3 games and played in a very limited and ineffective fashion in weeks 16 and 17, putting up 0 fantasy points both weeks. If you've seen any of my other content, then you know that this Rams offense got a lot worse. And what have they done? Halfway through the season, they started to make some changes. They started using more 12 personnel packages, aka 2 tight ends on the field. They were using this much more often, and the Rams offense was much more efficient as a result. But Higbee's production didn't exactly coincide with this transition to 12 personnel packages. I mean, what happened in weeks 10, 11, and 12? Higbee gathered 8.2 total fantasy points over those 3 games. So Higbee's breakout coincided with Gerald Everett's injuries, resulting in greater volume for Higbee. Without a doubt, Higbee has carved out a bigger role for himself in this Rams offense going forward. But the question remains, can we expect similar monstrous production from him this upcoming season, with the Rams playing in a more tight end-friendly offense? I think we're going to see a healthy averaging out of his production over the course of the year, and that will be in between what he did at the end of the 2019 season and what he did the previous 3.5 years of his career. I mean, we have to take into consideration that for 2 of those weeks, weeks 13 and 17, Tyler Higbee faced the worst defensive units against the tight end position, and Gerald Everett was not on the field to compete with him for tight end targets. The Cardinals literally refused to cover opposing tight ends, and Higbee, He's currently being drafted in the 8th and 9th round, and while he probably helped some of you win your league last year, I'm not taking him before guys like Hayden Hurst and Mike Gesicki. If you want more quality content to crush your league, subscribe so you don't miss anything. I'll be posting every Tuesday and Friday. I'll see you guys on the next vid.